They said we died that night, but we were only just beginning to live. The house was silent except for the sound of the wind scraping dry branches against the window pane. Snow fell in slow spirals outside, cloaking the world in a stillness that didn't match the storm brewing within. Inside, two teenage boys sat on the floor of their shared room, hearts pounding, shadows from a dying fireplace flickering across their pale faces. Noah had wrapped his arms around Eli, holding him tightly as Eli trembled, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with panic. Minutes earlier, Eli had come home in tears, his backpack ripped, his shirt stained with slurs written in permanent marker. The bullying had grown worse. Someone had followed him. Someone had seen him cry. And Noah did what any brother would do. He held him. They didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. The door slammed open with the force of thunder. Reverend Thomas stood in the doorway, down, shoulders wide, fury in his eyes. His wife, Miriam, hovered behind him, face tight and cold as stone. And in that moment, the warmth of home vanished. "What are you?" Thomas had growled, not asking, but accusing. Neither boy spoke. There were no words that would be believed. It wasn't the slurs that followed that hurt most. It was the sound of the trash bags being thrown onto the icy porch, the soft thud of Eli's journal being torn from his nightstand, and the harsh snap of its pages ripped apart, fed into the fireplace like kindling. The flames danced, devouring each word he'd ever written. His thoughts, his fears, his dreams, gone. Miriam said nothing. She only watched, arms crossed, lips pursed, a silent judge to the sentencing her husband had already carried out. Thomas's voice cracked like a whip. "You've both died to me." Outside, the snow kept falling. With nothing but the clothes on their backs and 20 crumpled dollars in Noah's coat pocket, the twins stepped into the night. No shoes for Eli, he hadn't had time. He clutched one item, trembling in his hand, a piece of paper Noah had once drawn in 3rd grade. A childish sketch of a house where everyone gets to be loved. It was all they had. They didn't look back. Beneath the overpass, the world felt quieter. The hum of passing cars overhead, the faint drip of melting snow from the concrete ledge, and the distant howl of a dog were their lullabies. Noah kept Eli close, wrapping his arms around him like a shield against the cold. His hands were stiff, his own eyes stinging from the wind, but he didn't sleep. He just watched his brother breathe, whispering, "We're still here. No matter what they say, we're still here." In the days that followed, hunger would become familiar. Cold would be constant. The warmth of human kindness would be a memory faint and almost unreal. But in that first night, what hurt most wasn't the frostbitten toes or the ache in their stomachs. It was the echo of Thomas's words. They had not lost a home. They had been erased from their own story. Still, they walked forward. With every step away from that house, away from the church, away from the people who claimed to love them only under conditions, they began to write a new one. A story not of shame, but survival. And this is how it began. If this story has gripped your heart, follow us at Heart Story for the next part. Because some stories aren't just meant to be told, they're meant to be heard. Under the bridge, time lost its meaning. Days blurred into one another, marked only by the growl of their stomachs and the shifting shadows cast by streetlights above. Noah and Eli learned quickly which diners left their trash bins unlocked and which corners were safe enough to close their eyes. At night, they huddled together beneath an old tarp, sharing body heat and listening to the city thrum around them. Eli spoke less with each passing day. The boy who once filled pages with stories and painted sunsets with words now stared blankly at concrete walls, his voice retreating into silence. Noah did everything he could, scavenging for bread that wasn't molded, trading hours of sleep for scraps of food, whispering old memories to remind Eli they were still alive. But grief, when it goes unspoken, grows louder in the mind. One evening, Noah returned from a soup line that had run out of food by the time he got there. The spot beneath the bridge where Eli usually waited was empty. Panic struck fast and hard. He searched every nearby alley, calling out in hoarse whispers, afraid to be too loud and draw attention. Then, down by the riverbank, he saw a small figure crouched near the edge, soaked in moonlight and shivering violently. Eli's arms were wrapped around his knees, eyes unfocused, lips moving with barely a sound. As Noah drew closer, he finally heard it. "I'm sorry. I make everything harder. You'd be better without me." The words shattered something in Noah. He fell to his knees in the wet grass, pulling Eli into his arms, holding him tighter than ever before. No explanations, no corrections, just presence, just warmth. They stayed that way for a long time until the flash of a camera startled them both. From the trees stepped a man in his late 50s, his face weathered but kind, holding an old film camera around his neck. He introduced himself simply Harper, a photographer who'd once traveled the world capturing conflict, now retired and roaming the city documenting forgotten stories. But what he didn't say at first, what he carried in his silence, was that he'd once had a son, a boy named Aaron, who'd grown up quietly, hiding his truth until the weight became too much. Harper had found him too late, but this time, he hadn't. Harper took the boys home, not to a shelter, not to a system, but to his own modest apartment above an old bookstore. He gave them warm soup and clean clothes, and let them sleep in peace for the first time in weeks. The next morning, there were no questions, just paper, pens, and silence. Noah didn't know how to start, but Harper pointed to the blank page and said softly, "Write what they tried to burn." Eli hesitated longest. His hands trembled as he held a pencil, hovering over the paper like it might bite. But eventually he began to draw first, the outline of a house, then fire, then two small figures walking away from it. Days turned into weeks. Harper taught them to use art as armor. He showed Noah how light and shadow could reshape pain into design, how a stage could tell a story without a single word. He taught Eli how movement could become language, how a body could dance truths too deep for speech. They learned to speak again, not in apologies, but in creation. In Harper's apartment, the walls began to fill with color, paintings, sketches, choreography notes. They hung old photos of themselves, not to mourn, but to mark the distance traveled. One night, Eli whispered to Noah, and they sat watching the snow return to the city. "I thought I was disappearing," Noah replied. "You weren't. You were just waiting for the light to find you." And this time, it had. In the stillness of Harper's apartment, something miraculous began to grow. Not overnight, not without setbacks, but with the quiet determination of two souls who had survived being erased. Noah and Eli, once buried beneath rejection and silence, started to become. Noah gravitated towards structure, light grids, angles, layers of fabric and shadow. He spent hours reading Harper's old books on theater and set design, sketching until his fingers cramped. What began as doodles soon evolved into entire blueprints for imagined stages, complete with moving lights and translucent backdrops. Where once he'd drawn a dream of a house where everyone gets to be loved, now he designed entire worlds where truth could be seen, heard, and felt. Eli moved differently. For him, healing came through motion. At first, he danced only when alone movements, small, hesitant, almost like breathing. But Harper saw him, not just with the eyes of a man who appreciated form, but with the soul of a father who had once failed to see in time. He cleared a corner of the bookstore's basement and turned it into a makeshift studio. Old mirrors, cracked wooden floor, a speaker that only worked on one side. In that space, Eli learned to speak again, not in sentences, but in rhythms. His body told the stories he could not write. The trembling hands of a bee left in the cold, the collapse of being called an abomination, the ache of watching fire consume a diary filled with dreams. Noah began building stage pieces around Eli's movement, first small, then more ambitious. One night at Sarsitu, Harper walked in to find the boys rehearsing a piece with nothing but one overhead light and a paper backdrop scrawled with the words, "We were never lost. You just stopped looking." It was Harper who suggested they take it beyond those four walls. He had contacts, old friends in community art spaces, nonprofit groups, queer youth shelters. What if, he asked, they built something for others like them? Something that wasn't about begging for acceptance, but claiming space. That was how the Still Breathing Project began. At its core, it was simple, a creative sanctuary for LGBTQ+ youth who had been rejected, abandoned, or silenced. A space where they could rebuild their memories through light, sound, movement, and voice. The first workshop took place in a rundown black box theater in Brooklyn, with borrowed lights and folding chairs. No sponsors, no budget, just stories waiting to be seen. The first show had 10 performers, each one holding pain that could barely be carried. Yet stepping onto the stage anyway, Noah lit them like warriors. Eli choreographed a closing piece that ended in a spotlight falling on an empty chair, a symbol of every parent who never showed up. The audience cried. And when someone recorded that final scene and posted it online, something unexpected happened. The video went viral not because it was trendy, but because it was true. Wow. The performance was raw, unrehearsed, and utterly honest. The title was simple: We Don't Want Your Forgiveness. We Want to Breathe. Suddenly, people were listening. Donations began arriving from strangers. Human rights organizations reached out. A famous actor reposted the video with the caption, "Art like this saved my life." Within months, the Still Breathing Project had multiple residencies, partnerships, and youth waiting lists in 3 cities. Eli and Noah were invited to speak at universities, festivals, and fundraisers. But they never let the project become about them. It wasn't their spotlight to keep, it was one they'd promised to pass forward. Still, beneath all the progress, a quiet ache remained. They had built something beautiful from the ashes, but the fire had never been theirs to begin with. It had been lit by people who still refused to see them. And one day, as they stood before a map planning future tour stops, Noah placed a finger on a small town neither of them had spoken of in years, the place they had once called home. He looked at Eli and said, "What if we brought the show there, not to forgive, not to be welcomed, but to show that they had survived despite it all?" Eli stared at the name for a long moment, then nodded. Some memories are not meant to be buried. They are meant to be retold. The decision wasn't made lightly. Returning to the village meant returning to the origin of their undoing. It meant walking the same streets where whispers had once followed their footsteps, where neighbors closed their doors just a little faster when they passed by. But Noah and Eli weren't returning as children seeking approval. They were artists, founders, survivors bringing with them a story that refused to stay buried. The plan was simple on paper: one performance. One night, held in the town's old community hall, a building that had once hosted revival meetings led by their father, Reverend Thomas. But the implications were far more complex. The moment their proposal for the performance was announced, the village split down its quiet center. Some claimed to support the arts, others feared the scandal. But no voice was louder or more strategic than Thomas himself. Since leaving the pulpit, Thomas had set his sights on public office. He was now a candidate in the upcoming mayoral election, positioning himself as the moral backbone of the community. The reappearance of his 2 sons, now public figures and openly gay, threatened to unravel that carefully constructed image. Behind closed doors, he lobbied local officials to deny the venue permit. He called emergency council meetings under the guise of preserving traditional values. In church bulletins and town forums, his name reappeared alongside veiled warnings about outside influences. But the show went forward. Too many eyes were watching now. Too many organizations had offered support. Backing down would have only confirmed the very shame the twins had long outgrown. It was Miriam, their mother, who made the most public move. At a hastily arranged press conference outside the town chapel, she stood before cameras in a gray shawl and tear-streaked makeup. Her voice trembled as she pleaded, "I'm begging them not to bring shame upon our family. We have suffered enough. Why expose such wounds again?" She paused, letting the silence sink in before adding, "I never stopped loving them, but some truths, some choices, should remain private." Her performance was calculated, vulnerable enough to garner sympathy, vague enough to deny responsibility. The media latched on quickly. Headlines used words like controversial and painful reunion. Talk as the shows invited pundits to debate the boundaries between personal trauma and public art. But for Noah and Eli, there was nothing theoretical about what they were doing. It wasn't protest, it was remembrance. The night before the performance, as they prepared lighting cues and reviewed the stage setup, Noah walked the perimeter of the hall. Everything felt smaller now, the walls, the ceiling, the town itself. He could hear the faint echo of his father's voice from years ago, preaching about righteousness and fire, salvation and sin. But tomorrow, when it would be their voices filling that space. Eli rehearsed in silence, each movement carved with precision. His choreography had evolved into a language of memory, deliberate, unrelenting. Every gesture carried the weight of what had been stolen. That afternoon, there was one final press interview. The reporter asked, "Do you think your parents will attend?" Noah responded calmly, "That's not the question. The question is whether they'll listen." And then came the moment that would be remembered. Backstage, just before the performance, someone handed Eli a note. It was unsigned, written in a familiar hand. "Please don't go through with this. We're begging you. Don't destroy what's left of us." He stared at the paper, then folded it neatly and tucked it away. When the curtain lifted, the room was packed. Locals filled the folding chairs. Members of the press stood in the back. A few activists had made the trip, and near the exit doors stood Thomas and Miriam, silent, unmoving. The lights dimmed. The stage flickered to life, a projection of fire, slow and engulfing. Two figures appeared in silhouette. A voiceover whispered fragments of real memories, slurs muttered under breath, the sound of torn pages, the weight of footsteps fading behind a closed door. In the final act, the projection vanished. Only Eli remained on stage, moving with a rawness that couldn't be softened. And at the crescendo, he stopped, turned toward the audience, and spoke the only line in the entire piece. "When you burned my words, you didn't erase me. You erased yourself from my heart. No more, no less." The audience didn't applaud, not out of protest, but because the silence said more than clapping ever could. The performance ended not with a final bow, but with the slow descent of light into darkness. No curtain dropped, no music played, just stillness. And for several long moments, no one moved. It was as if the entire room had forgotten how to breathe. Then the whispers began, not loud, but charged. Some cried, others sat frozen, eyes unfocused. Thomas and Miriam were nowhere to be seen. The title of the show had been simple, Shatter. And that night, something had. After the audience trickled out and the stage was cleared, a small group remained. Among them was a man in a charcoal suit, his presence unassuming, but his purpose precise. He stepped forward and addressed Noah and Eli directly. "Without microphone or script, I represent the legal team managing several community redevelopment projects," he said, "and I've been authorized to make an announcement on behalf of two anonymous donors who followed your journey since the beginning." He paused, pulling out a folded document. "We are here to confirm that the central land parcel this building, the square outside, the surrounding lots has been purchased in full, effective immediately. This space will be designated a commemorative site in honor of LGBTQ+ individuals who have faced exile, abuse, or erasure by their communities." The silence that followed was heavier than applause. Then came the final declaration. "The village name will be removed from public registry. In its place, this area will now be known as Outlast Village, a living archive of survival." Gasps rippled through the remaining crowd. Someone dropped their phone. An older man clutched his chest, not from offense, but from something far deeper, recognition. Noah looked at Eli. They didn't need to speak. Their eyes said everything. Outside, workers were already removing the rusted town signage. By morning, the post would hold a new name, a new history, one not written by exclusion, but by reclamation. As they stood beneath the street lamp, The same street where they had once been called slurs and spat on. Eli reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the worn piece of paper Noah had drawn when they were children. The little sketch of a house, stick figures smiling, and the words, "Everyone gets to be loved." It had survived the years, the cold, the fire, and now it was home again. That night, before leaving the village for the final time, Eli stood in the middle of the square and whispered to his brother, "I'm not the one who has to try so hard to be kept anymore." Noah nodded, holding back tears. They didn't stay for the ceremonies that followed. They had no interest in parades or handshakes. What needed to be said had already been carved into stone, into movement, into light. As they walked down the road, bags over their shoulders, someone called after them, "What should we tell the papers about you two?" Noah turned only slightly. "Tell them we never came back. We just made space for the ones who never got to leave." And that was the truth. Outlast Village wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about breaking the silence that had once nearly killed them and giving others the language to survive. Now, the question is yours. If you were given the chance to rename the place that broke you, what would you call it? Share your answer in the comments. And if stories like this stay with you, don't forget to follow Heart's story, where survival isn't just honored, it's spoken aloud.